talk about oxygen potential. Well, let's say, for example, again, drawing our usual graph. Right, and the resting moment potential sitting somewhere, oh, actually not that high, closer to the potassium, minus 70. Okay. Now let's say, for example, like I said, if we change the permeability of ions, resting moment potential moves, that means the membrane potential moves. So let's say, for example, some magic positive charges came about. So there's more positive in the membrane, around the membranes of the line. The membrane potential becomes a little positive. Okay. What happens then? So in this particular example, we have these, let's draw the cell the way we did before, just because it's like, it's a cell, some sodium channels. Cool. Let's say, for example, this magic positive charges came about, which is why there was this increase here. But what that did was it opened some additional sodium channels that we called voltage-gated sodium channels. Voltage-gated sodium channels, which only open when a threshold voltage is reached. Only open when threshold voltage is reached. Okay, because of these magical positive charges that came about. How did it come about? We don't have to think about that right now, but I'm just telling you it came about. And that's why this voltage-gated sodium channel opened. Okay. Now, if they opened, all these other sodium ions would kind of like rush in, right? Because remember, they want to go towards here. They want to reach plus 40. So because the permeability has increased, the membrane becomes more positive until like it reached plus 40. That's what they want. Right? There's this special characteristics of this particular voltage-gated sodium channels. They open a threshold, which is fine, but they close quickly. Oops. Because they have two gates, the activation gate, the inactivation gate. The activation gate opens when the threshold is reached. They close quickly. They only stay open for a little bit of time, and then the inactivation gate kind of takes over, and the inactivation gate closes. Okay. And the inactivation gate would not open until it goes back to like minus 70. Okay. So this inactivation gate closes. What happened if the gate closes? I mean, the permeability of sodium decreased. And if permeability of sodium decreased, they would want to go back to this previous resting moment potential, right? So it would kind of go down. Another thing that happens around this time is there are some potassium channel which also opens. There's some voltage-gated potassium channels in the mix. Funnily enough, they also open at threshold. Actually, I would say they are triggered to open at threshold. So they're triggered to open when the threshold voltage is reached, which is like around here. Okay. But the thing is, they're very slow to open. They're very slow to open, so it takes a little bit of time for them to open. By the time they do open, which is like around here, oops, sorry. like Apple Pencil, okay, which is around here. By that time, the membrane has already become very positive, right? So let's recap here. So over here was our magical positive charge, right? So we call that, if the membrane becomes more positive, we call it depolarization. So this is our magical depolarization. We don't know how that happened yet. I'll tell you later, but that has happened. And because of this depolarization, this threshold voltage was reached. Okay. Threshold voltage was reached, right? And because of this threshold voltage, we have both of the channels were triggered to open, right? So potassium and sodium voltage gated channels triggered to open. But only sodium ones actually opened, right? So sodium channels opened, sodium got in, right? And made the membrane more positive, right? So depolarized, like further away. And this is the rising phase, we call it. That happened. Okay, cool. That's fine. And at this point, I told you that the sodium channels, the voltage gated sodium channels, close because the inactivation closed. I mean, not close, I would say inactivated actually. Sodium channels inactivated. Okay, so they're closed, basically. And that's why the permeability of sodium decreases. And at the same time, I'm gonna do a different color. The voltage-gated potassium channels opened, right? Finally, because they were slowly open, they finally opened. So what would happen? The potassium would get out, right? Because the potassium wants to leave. Remember, the potassium wants to leave, and if they leave the cell, the membrane would become more and more negative. They become more and more negative. Cool, getting very negative. Where do they want to go? Remember, potassium wants to go here. They want to go closer to the equilibrium potential of potassium. They want to go around -90, right? But as soon as they kind of get below the threshold, the sodium voltage gated channels, they become like the inactivation gate opens. That doesn't matter because their activation gate is going to close that threshold, right? So those are going to be closed. That's fine. That's not important to know right now, but just telling you. So the potassium is going to keep leaving the cell, making the cell more and more negative until the potassium gate's closed. Now, they're triggered to close around here, around threshold. Again, they're slow to close as well. So they're going to keep allowing potassium to get out of the cell until they finally close, and then things are kind of coming back to normal because the permeability of both the ions are now going to come back to how it was before because all the voltage gated channels have closed. Kind of like the overview of it. There are a lot of nitty-gritties to it. Let's talk about that for a little bit. So remember that the voltage gated sodium channels became inactivated around here? I don't know what this does that, but it became inactivated around here. So from this point to around the point where threshold is reached again, this is called absolute refractory period. Just because no matter how positive the cell becomes or how much you try it, the voltage gated sodium channels would not open. Like they are inactivated, right? They would not open. So that's absolute refractory period. Around here, the time it takes for like the undershoot and to like coming back to the resting moment potential. This is the relative refractory period. Because it's just harder for them to kind of start another action potential. All right, so this whole thing is an action potential. The magnitude of it, so that means like the maximum that it can reach, does not change. Like that is not dependent on like how strong the signal is. Okay. The only thing you could probably change a little bit in terms of, hey, this signal is super important, it's high, like very strong signal. The only thing you could do is by shortening this relative refractory period so that it's like easier to start another one. Okay. And the distance between one action potential and the other action potential is just shorter. That's it. So you can change the frequency, but you cannot change the magnitude. I'm happy to elaborate that one if I do another video on it, but for now, that's kind of all I wanted to mention about action potential. Oh, right. Very quickly, I'm gonna do where these magical positive charges came from. Right. Let's say, for example, this is an axon, and we have one action potential that just happened here, allowed a lot of sodium to come in, so it became like very positive. Some of it kind of drifted off to the side and made this part a little positive, enough to hit threshold, enough to start an action potential. That's where the magical positive charges were coming from. They were just coming from the side somewhere. And that is how action potential is propagated in one direction. Why doesn't it go backwards? Let's talk about that. And that has to do with the fact that there is this absolute refractory period. So if we have an action potential here, say here, and positive charges are coming in, and they're going in both directions. But remember, over here, like over this side, this membrane is kind of they're in this phase. That means their sodium channels are inactivated and will not be opened. So that's why even if the positive charges kind of flow in both directions, the action potential can only go in one direction. Yeah, let me know if that's not clear and we could talk about that as well. But yeah, I think that is basically it. Thank you so much for entertaining me while I practice these. But yeah, this might be a little bit out of the scope just because like the basics are probably more to do with physiology or neuroscience, but I kind of wanted to go through it so that you can imagine these and also feel like, wow, this is beautiful because that's what I feel all the time. I feel these are so beautiful, make so much sense. You could play around with them. And yeah, if you feel like taking physiology, I would super support that because I love physiology and neuroscience. So yeah, happy to talk about that as well if you're interested. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions.